I'm Bernard Liebov from BoxoPROJECTS, for those of you who don't know me, the director. So as I said, Vesna was introduced to me by a local artist here in the community, Mary Addison Hackett, and we've gotten to know each other a little bit over the distance. Vesna teaches at Vanderbilt College and is coming from her studio there, or her home studio. I'm not sure, she'll tell us about that. But I'm very much looking forward to this talk with Karley Sullivan, who's usually located in Los Angeles, but as she'll tell you, she's located somewhere else right now. So welcome. I think if you have any questions, please put them into the chat box, and there will be a time to go through questions at the end of the talk. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karley and Vesna.
All right, now I'm with you. Yeah, I met Vesna many years ago after being really astounded by her work at the Frick Museum in Nashville. And so we've kept in touch. She's really one of my favorite artists and also one of my favorite people. She's an associate professor of art at Vanderbilt in Nashville, and her projects examine the evolving relationship between memory and contemporary culture and the technologies of photographic image production. I'm a little nervous that I'm going to lose my Zoom because I'm in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains and the connection is really bad. So forgive me if I get a little glitchy. Vesna examines photographic representation of specific political and cultural histories. And she expands the photographic image beyond its frame, the traditional format, and the narrative is central to her artistic strategies. There's two projects in particular that I love of Vesna's that are recent. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to picture. There we go, that should make it better. Okay, and one of them is Mixtape. So just recently I got in touch with Vesna because she had done this project called Mixtape, where she had Nashville museums based in Nashville now for several years remix songs from Vesna's native Serbia. And then it became a series of photos, exhibitions, public events, and performances, and also a cassette tape. I thought it would be really nice to start out one of the songs from Mixtape. And I'd like to go ahead and do that now. Let's see. We didn't have the Mixtape, let's see. Sorry, folks. And I'm having a little trouble here, so I'll just keep going. One of the things that's really interested me about Vesna's current work is that she's been getting into doing a lot of working in a more as producer and director rather than just going into the archive and pulling things out. She went back to the Serbian musicians and had them remixed by contemporary Nashville musicians. And then the recent project that she did in Mississippi with the Lovell Archive. The Lovell Archive was the archive of a slaveholder, and using working students of History 328, the Slavery, Race, and University class. The students worked in groups and presented their research as a sound performance where actually read the name of the enslaved. So what Vesna did is she went in and started to draw things out of this archive and draw attention to what was not seen or what was not included, kind of in essence like creating a remix of the archive, which I'm just really fascinated in the way that she's working in this new kind of collaborative fashion and creating these kind of remixes. And I wanted to start out our conversation because we've only got like 45 minutes before we go into doing questions. And so Vesna, in your recent work, I see you working in this kind of as a collaborative director. And I feel that by inviting others to participate, you're engaging in a type of remixing, which kind of folds the hindsight of now into a very specific then, which is what you go into these really specific archives, whether it be about the Morongo Basin, going into the Love Archive, or the Serbian archives. Going into an archive and then remixing it in this collaborative way is also a way of reminding us that we spring from them. It's remixing. Do you think of the archive as a living thing, as something that's still growing? Can you talk about how the archive can be expanded through collaboration and how the inclusion of sound plus image contributes to that collaborative spirit in your recent work?
Hey, thank you, Karley. I also have some acknowledgements to make. So I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank Mary Addison Hackett, whom I see in the box listening to a shelf, I think, trying to hear what we're saying, who connected me with BoxoPROJECTS and Bernard, I guess 2 years ago. And who would have thought that in 2018, while I was back in Serbia, at my Fulbright fellowship, trying to imagine, like, okay, what would I do in Joshua Tree and for BoxoPROJECTS residency? And I was trying to imagine this, and I was thinking about trying to listen to some radio and all that. And who would think that we would come to this now, where I am in Nashville, actually in my studio. And not able to come to Joshua Tree, although we imagined that 2 years ago. So I want to thank Bernard and Amy Buya who put this together. And I think that it's sort of a joint effort. Like, I guess it's a communal effort to go through the times that we live in now. And I want to thank Karley, who has like an unstable network, but this unstable network should not sort of dismiss her effort. That she came up with some really great questions for me to think about. And so I'm grateful, Karley, to you. And also, like when I was thinking about like, oh, what would I do in Joshua Tree now that I cannot go? And so I also want to acknowledge Hadley, my husband, who said, wait, why don't you listen to U2 Joshua Tree album all over again, which I did. And so I've started with YouTube and with Joshua Tree famous iconic album and images of the desert and great music. I mean, I still think it's a great record, great rock record. And so those are my acknowledgements. So thank you. And so I want to go back now to you, Karley, to thinking to your question about Mixtape, which was sort of a project that I did in Nashville 2 years ago, and it sort of was, as you say, like remixing of two different cultures. In the 1990s, Serbia, I used to work as a photographer during the sort of the breakup of the country, and I took a lot of black and white photographs, a lot of images of protests, student protests, things that were happening. I worked with non-government groups and such as, say, Women in Black, who was a pacifist anti-war group, and I took these images that and collaborated with writers and different people, trying to sort of document the time and also the sentiment of some sort of resistance, personal resistance, but also the fact that I was there and I was there during the multiple wars in that decade, and I unlike many others who decided to leave the country, and at that point, like I think some numbers say that about 100,000 young people left the country, and I was not able, and I didn't want to. And so I took that time as a sort of a time for some poetic representations of trauma and suffering and loss, and I did collaborate with people and took these photographs, which then became an important archive for me to revisit now from the perspective of like a couple of years ago and Trumpism in America and kind of this sort of a little bit of a hopeless moment in American history. And so I kind of remembered the 1919 Serbia, and I remembered how I felt then and how making work was a way to move forward and to think about work and think about hope. And so as someone who, as you may know, listening to rock music, I worked as a rock photographer also for a magazine. So I photographed a lot of important bands, and I'm sorry we couldn't hear the beginning, but it's all on the website. But I took these photographs of rock bands actually and their covers, and so here's the connection with covers and album covers. And I worked with a friend, Vladimir Jerić-Vlidi, a media historian and also a musician from a well-known Serbian band called Darkwood Dub. And so he and I sort of transcribed some of the songs and chose these 12 songs of the Serbian bands that I then offered to some of the Nashville-based musicians to interpret and sing in Serbian. And so these Nashville musicians were really amazing. I worked with Lonnie Hutchins, who's a local producer, and we produced a tape. And actually I have a tape, and that, so I can show you something. I did actually make a small audio tape that's a mixtape, and that tape was presented and heard and both in a concert, but also in the gallery, Zeitgeist Gallery in Nashville, and then in Belgrade in 2019 while I was there. And we organized a concert in the gallery. And so it was important for me to allow these, and the American musicians, Nashville-based American musicians, were actually singing in Serbo-Croatian. So it was this really a translation, and the production of this tape was an effort to connect these two disparate environments, but through this same sort of moment of desperation, but also as a moment of resistance, and a moment to actually try to offer some hope. And I thought, and some people here have seen that show, and for me it was this kind of stepping into an environment in the gallery where you can actually hear the music coming from vintage boom boxes that you can see some of them behind me here in the studio. Like I've sourced a bunch of old devices because I am interested in technology and obsolete technology and how obsolete technology can offer not only the nostalgic remembrance of time, but also have the political agency in the gallery space. And somewhat what originally I wanted to do with BoxoPROJECTS was to organize a slideshow, community slideshow, some of which I do typically as projects in different places, and offer actually these different stories to come together through the technology. So technology for me has this different role. So it's not only the aesthetic of it that I like, but it's also the political agency that the technology can introduce to the story. So remixing of cultural histories or expanding on the archive. So for Mixtape, I was a sort of a personal curator of my own archive and found a way to translate archive and sound, to also think about sound in a form of an archive, to think how that sound would translate in a different environment. And I think that the response was interesting, and the musicians were like really got it right away, and we produced the tape, and so it was a kind of an interesting moment of coming together in the gallery and during the concert. And we organized the concert and the lecture actually by Vladimir in the gallery. so the sound and images, like I think about, when I thought about BoxoPROJECTS, and I thought about Joshua Tree, which I've never been to. So that's an additional kind of a problem. How do you think about the place or the space that you only know from popular culture or from just reading about it or so on? So then you start by, thinking about different people, but maybe we can talk about that in a little bit. Karley asked about the project that I'm working on now, which also was starting to happen at the same time as Mixtape, as I was in Suwanee, actually University of the South, and I have I've been offered to engage with a group of students and a history professor there on talking about an archive that was discovered in the university, and that archive is the John Quitman and Lovell family archive, which were the storied slave owners and the storied family in the university, tied to the university history, but also were slave owners. And so what struck me in that archive was the fact that all objects, all photographs were obviously only the slave owners and the family, and whereas the enslaved were non-existent or existent only through names and values and years and age and so on. So I've worked with students, and there was this like obvious problem of me engaging with that archive, or students who are mostly white also working with this archive. And so we were trying to gauge this necessity of thinking about how do you represent something in photography or through the artistic means that has been diminished from the beginning. How do you not objectify further through photography or through any kind of art these voices of the enslaved, or how do you amplify them versus put them again into some representational modes and so on. So there is that kind of element of again the loss and the trauma of and the history, obviously the very painful history that archive brought up, but also the moment of reconciliation or the need to think about this archive, and for students to think about it, for me, for that professor, for everybody. And so we did what I proposed to do, and what we did in the end was for 45 minutes, we read the names of the enslaved that were transcribed from the archive. And so there was a moment in a convocation hall, in a very, very solemn historical place in Suwanee, we set up this event that lasted for 45 minutes. It was a community-based event, something that I'm interested in doing, kind of bringing different people together, the community members, to actually acknowledge the history, as painful as it may be. So there was that moment of coming together, reading the names, and presenting that event in a community screening, we called it, and that is also available on as an edited piece on the website. So yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, Karley, I think that sort of expands, like, so you called me a producer. I don't know what that if
working
I
as like a
producer.
collaborative director,
Yeah.
or kind of a producer of these opportunities to expand upon the archive using what you found.
Yeah, and like it's interesting, like we're so this the entirety of this event is like, like sometimes people share pictures and so on, and I know that we'll have a few frames, but we don't have pictures. We were kind of thinking about this. It's interesting to think about representation without even talking, like describing things, rather than bringing them together on the screen. I guess it also underlines this impossibility of where we are right now, in terms of impossibility to go and be there at that space, and the challenge of that representation that we have now on how do we make work or present work. And I think artists have been affected, obviously, very much so by the crisis that we are in right now.
So do you think of, I've been wanting to ask you this question, Vesna. Do you think of the archive as a living thing? Like when you go back into these archives, do you consider the work that you're doing as like an addition or like a revisitation? Is it still growing? Are you contributing to it as you re-examine, kind of go back into it? Is that something that you thought about?
Yeah. I think archives continue to grow. I think they are living, and in fact, a few years ago, in 2013, in Sao Paulo, I was a part of the show called Alive Archive, which kind of took that concept with a different work. So there is a sense, that we are, taking. Borrowing or appropriating objects from different archives for me has inspired me to take on different histories. So whether those were histories of former Yugoslavia, where I'm from, and which I have revisited and participated in that kind of a time of Yugoslav socialism, and trying to remember my participation there. So taking on some of the archives from that era, or taking on my personal work as an archive and then representing that work, kind of constantly is I think of it as a process of transformation, as a process of thinking or discovering something about how we remember. So ultimately, it is about remembrance. It is about memory of what we want to remember and what we sort of choose to remember out of different histories. So for me, for example, like I have grown up in this kind of golden era of Yugoslav socialism, but that doesn't mean that I'm romanticizing that era, or through my work, I'm questioning some of the belief or disbelief in certain systems or certain histories. And so the way how we remember is, history really teaches us to think about dates and to think about certain events that make or that we learn about then through history books and so on. But memory allows us to play with the archive and with time and to translate that. And in my way, I mean, in my work, I try to take pieces of that history and think through it through the lens of memory, and how that memory becomes then visible today. So sort of there is the dichotomy between the memory and history in terms of what we remember and how, and then we actually start to forget at some point. And recently in 2019, I went to Serbia to do this video work with exactly Women in Black, and we went to some places, and at those places I actually could not remember the places, but I remember the photographs that I took of these places. So, like there is a role that photograph or photography plays in, for me, in my life and in my work, in a sense that it allows me to remember, and it allows me to really, it is the viewfinder. Actually, I remember things through the frame that I have, once photographed. And then that kind of thinking of the when I was this week, I took time to just think about Joshua Tree and think about homesteading and think about memory. I read this article on salvaging of memory in a homesteading in Montana, in fact, that was kind of part of this utopian move to the West. And there is as a way how that article argues, written by Caitlin De Silvi, how actually memory allows us, or how objects actually allow us to remember some of the things radically, and how these objects, it's a nice text that allowed the author to work in a farm and take some objects of the farm, replace them or relocate them into the landscape, and then rephotograph them. So I thought that was like a nice way of thinking about how a certain object that you can find either in a flea market or in any other library or bookstore or so on can actually become
I think
an object. So in my like I want to show people this. Maybe people from Joshua Tree
Wait,
know
Vesna,
this.
let me ask you, I don't want to interrupt, but I think that's a great entry point to what I was wondering. This residency, because of COVID, became something that you're having this challenge of working in a way where you don't have access to these objects. You actually don't have access to the archive in the same way that maybe you originally thought that you would, or that we all thought that you would when this residency was proposed. So how is that challenge of working in this new way and like actually working with this kind of really bounded frame upon frame upon frame? We're all in these little screens now. So like, how has the challenge of working really truly from afar, you really are coming at this from a great distance. So has that challenge like sparked your imagination, or has that played into how you're starting to approach this residency?
Well, it did. And like I've reached out to people I knew. I've reached out to Mary Addison. I said, Mary Addison, what shall I do? Where do I start? Then, then came the YouTube and the Joshua Tree album, and I started rolling in my mind. And then came the Antonioni, Zabriskie Point, and,
I want to talk about Zabriskie too.
yeah. And, so and obviously Joshua Tree is just such a rich space and place in everybody's imagination. It's like this, what authors call the imaginary. That is translated in so many different ways by so many different artists, and I've looked into many of them. Mostly the Kim Strong-Fellow's very rich work on the ecosystem of the desert and the Small Tract Act and the jackrabbit housing. I've reached out to with the help of Bernard to Gary Daigneault, if I'm pronouncing the right. He's the director of the or one of the radio hosts in the FM 107.7 Desert Radio. So I've turned on and listened to the Desert Radio a little bit while I was in Nashville here in studio. And, I was kind of transported a little bit into the desert. I've made just a wild phone call to Sagebrush Press bookstore and actually talked with Janet Krongheid, and I'm really grateful to Janet because she really did ship me this little piece, this pamphlet that you selected some of these lithographs from, which I thought were really beautiful, and we shared some of these, which is written by Ed Ainsworth, and about the people who love the desert. And so I've tried to find some ways that I can sort of connect with the place, kind of thinking about, I've listened a little bit to the Desert Oracle radio, so that seemed like that created somewhat a little bit of the atmosphere, but I do understand that is sort of such a well-known kind of in the paradigm for people who live in Joshua Tree, and it just made me really want to visit the Joshua Tree. So it just made me think I need to come to the desert. Actually... I need to take pictures. I need to be there. So like it's just this impossibility, and the challenge of me sitting here and thinking made me like really eager to come to the desert. So I hope I can in March. Bernard, you'll work on that, right?
Absolutely.
Really, one of the things that I was thinking about is this, like the recent turn in your work towards this kind of collaborative, producing the work, directing the work. I think there could be something really interesting that could come of using this challenge of being from afar to think about how you're going to approach the project itself. And you know, you were talking about Zabriskie, and I went back and watched it, and it really is kind of the perfect movie to think about as somebody who is really a stranger in a strange land, trying to make a film about, you know, a particular culture, a very particular culture. So like, what is it about Zabriskie Point? You know, this movie, by the way, is available in full on YouTube for free. So if anybody wants to watch Antonioni's Zabriskie Point, it's just right there. It's great. So what was it about this film that kind of like got you going? And I've got some close screen, some frames that you shot while you were watching it.
So you mean I didn't have to go to Vanderbilt DVD library to bug them to give me that?
No, it's just right there on YouTube.
to make it happen for me. Yeah, so it's right. So you know, like oh, we see everybody. Yeah, so Zabriskie Point, you know, like I again talked with Mary Addison about I know she went to Zabriskie Point, and actually it's in the Death Valley, and took a photo there, which I have seen. And one of my previous works, ones that actually brought me back to working with analog technology and working with slideshows that I'm hoping to organize in March in the community, was my previous work called Search for Landscapes. And Search for Landscapes actually is like one of the sections of Antonioni's Blow Up movie that you know, it's one of my favorite films, and I've actually found that the title for that work for that body of work that deals with a woman's one woman travels around the world using Kodachrome technology, taking slides and then bringing slides back home, and kind of thinking about the expansion of an American tourist. And so the tourist is also like one kind of a character that is probably very dominant or in Joshua Tree, and I'm thinking about that role of tourists and tourism and discovering places and so on. So there is a connection, you know, with Antonioni, and I've seen Zabriskie Point a long time ago, so I got it back and kind of wanting to see it, and you know, the film really happens, and it was a big flop, but a masterful film that I highly recommend. And it is about what Antonioni himself says. It is a film about how people feel. It is an interior film, and so it captures a lot of real things: a strike, a student strike, a background of social unrest, of corporate America advancing, and real estate developing, and all of that is kind of set up against this countercultural moment, and beautiful moment, but then again shot in this landscape that is kind of a physical landscape of the desert that is so, you know, kind of thinking about, this is my screen that we're now like looking at of Antonioni that I've snapped a photo of, and it is also an abstract film, and that abstraction comes from Antonioni's use of telephoto lens. So that kind of the play in which characters almost like come into that mise-en-scène of Antonioni's stagings of his films is amazing. And it's something that after you know, there was a you know, it's something about abstraction, even with the final scene of explosion that was shot 16 times with 17 cameras, with 17 cameras simultaneously to really get that kind of a moment of abstraction going. Antonioni actually had a chance to visit Mark Rothko, the painter Mark Rothko, and to tell him that both of them have similar attitudes in terms of making things about nothingness. And so I thought that was beautiful, this kind of comment on Antonioni and his view of the desert as something that is totally abstract. And so there are, you know, it's set against also this backdrop of real estate expansion, which I think is a very kind of a acute problem of the Joshua Tree region, from what I'm getting from talking with people. So rather than just going into directly that with a documentary way, I think kind of looking through the desert through the lens of Antonioni's Zabriskie Point is an interesting way to think about the beauty of the landscape that resists in some way. So, you know, you can kind of think about this landscape, and you can look into this lithograph from 5 Acres of Heaven and really think, yes, that is that landscape still, and nothing can really take it away. And so in my mind, I'm imagining this, like I have this mental map of the place, of Joshua Tree, something that for me, and so thinking about the lens of Antonioni's abstraction as a way of entry into a project, or talking about these different histories of the place that are very utopian. And, you know, like when Mary Addison mentioned, okay, you should meet Bernard, and Bernard and I started talking, it wasn't like really clear to me, you know, Joshua Tree was like very exciting, and the residency in Joshua Tree was very kind of inviting and appealing. But in fact, it does connect with my work in a sense that I make work about historical utopias. I make work about these whether it's a Cuban kind of the abandoned garden of the Cuban Jibacoa site where Hershey, the famous chocolate magnate, used to have his sugar mill and then abandoned at the time of revolution, and I took pictures there. Or whether it's a Yugoslav kind of archive of films in a Museum of Yugoslavia archive that questions the role of Tito and this kind of the utopian kind of Yugoslav construct of the country that ceased to exist in the 1990s, that I then documented through my documentary work. So I come to Joshua Tree with this like real utopian instinct to think about historical utopias, about the advances of the land, both from the homesteaders through multiple times and through history, through the histories that maybe existed there but got erased along the way, but the landscape still sort of persisting and resisting in some way. And so that is something that is an entry point. And with the slideshow or this possible now maybe a video work in the making, I'm thinking about these different roles that people play in the ecosystem of Joshua Tree. And I'm thinking about the landscape that remains as a backdrop of these different histories that are sort of happening and advancing. And so in a way, I'm hoping with a slideshow that there would be a moment to bring up some of these histories through the lens of these technologies that I allow people to do. I set up stations, viewing stations, and allow people to bring some of these slides or stories and to actually represent them in a communal setting. And sort of, it's kind of like an interesting, kind of moment in time. We're here on these screens and Zooms and so on. We're in some ways able to share a lot, but we're also kind of cut off from each other and isolated in a certain way. So it's kind of an interesting construct. How do you build something out of nothing? How do you, like Antonioni, how do you make, how do you do something about nothing and make it beautiful? So that's where I am. Yeah.
Yeah. I know that you've connected with Stringfellow's work and been looking into kind of the documents of the homesteading. And you mentioned during one of our talks that, this practice of homesteading, which kind of begun, in the late 1930s, was a way of giving land to servicemen, primarily, probably, I mean, the entire history of America at this point, we're recognizing that it's kind of like drenched in this, white supremacy in a lot of ways. And the archive, examining an archive is not just a way of seeing what was included in the archive, but it's also a way of really noticing what is not. We're in a moment right now when artists and culture makers and everybody's kind of grappling with this idea of like, how do we participate in this movement to include voices that have been excluded, held down, neglected because of this kind of like dominant culture that in the US is actually quite racial. I was wondering, the radio archives, the far have really been coming from the kind of dominant culture to include, marginalized and voices or perspectives in. Do you have any leads as to where you might, you may draw attention to their absence if it is difficult to find?
Yeah, I could, I'm sort of you were cutting off, Karley, so I couldn't hear everything, but
Oh, no.
I'm sort of getting the general kind of sense of a question and where you're going with it. And I think it's like when reading a little bit about kind of the history of homesteading and Joshua Tree for doing this kind of research. So I obviously came across the text by Ron Carpenter, historian Ron Carpenter, who wrote about the significance of the frontier in American history, and the Turner, Frederick Jackson Turner's rhetorical impact of his frontier thesis. And so there's this, kind of understanding that in which he argues actually that the molds of the past myths are basis of action for the future. And so with this came the argument for the frontiersman, the pioneer, the rugged individual, the brave and strong and resourceful. And I think that kind of a production of myth that started then and continued through the American history has brought or kind of like we are in a kind of put us back to this cultural moment, the moment of reckoning, of historical reckoning, of understanding that, that we need to tell stories that are not comfortable. We need to recognize and acknowledge histories that have been erased, that we, that sometimes it's not enough to only acknowledge, but you have to act further. And I wonder what my voice in this thing is in this moment is as someone who is also not from here and someone who kind of constantly feels displaced both in former Yugoslavia and here and Serbia and kind of feeling that I'm kind of split all the time and sort of but kind of looking into that mode of and moment of displacement of different people and different histories and alongside kind of erasing histories. But I think that I was sitting recently in a workshop as part of this project that I'm doing with the University of the South in Suwanee, and that was done with Georgetown Memory Project, and that's the Georgetown University in Washington D.C. who famously sold a group of enslaved people to Suwanee, and hence that's how the connection was made between the two places. And some of the descendants of that group of enslaved people from Georgetown was there in that workshop. And we were talking about like, what can you do, and it was a powerful moment to really hear these people talk about the history that has been taken away from them. And you know, like as part of the research for the project, I am working with a genealogist in Jackson, Mississippi, that actually is looking into the records of the enslaved that we read the names of in 2018. And we're trying to actually get to them. But then, you know, there is a sensitivity in that effect too, at that moment of what do the descendants want and what is it that we can offer them. So it's a very clear question, and it's a very clear proposition. And I think as artists, or at least myself, I am ready to ask those questions and to stir up those conversations.
Yeah, that's why I was really drawn to including the Suwanee Project, because I was impressed with how you were making space for other voices in this kind of remixing of the archive. And I think that the work, you know, working with archives, it puts an artist in a unique position of really like participating in creation of history more actively, or in a very active way. I think that's why I wanted to bring that project into this. How's my sound? Is it okay?
Great.
Okay, good. Thank you. I'm so sorry for all the technical difficulties that came along with me today. Thank you for bearing with me. Is there any way that the audience can help you? I know that you're going to be looking for resources. You are actively seeking input. So how can everyone help you?
Yeah, and I'm, you know, I'm one of the things that, thank you, Karley, and one of the things that Bernard and I were talking about is like, how can we do something even if everything is canceled, and how can we, you know, and I'm finding myself like totally inspired, like I'm ready now, you know, from so many levels to just come and take pictures, or you know. But yeah, I do think that the audience or the community may be able to help by bringing in these different histories to that moment of communal sharing of images and stories that happens in 1 hour as like one event. I will be connecting with some of the different places which I know now was not possible because some of the places are actually closed because of the lockdown. The community slideshow is kind of this is an open call for people to bring their slides and share them in a communal setting. So for me, so I organize, I have the screens, I have the stands and the projectors, slide projectors, and I prepare them in a form of a photographic installation. So that aspect is always important to me. And then through the open call and contacts with people, anyone can bring slides, the carousels, and project them and talk about them. And I think this is kind of a moment in which, you know, the images that we work with at this point in time when it comes to recording and are these mediated objects. They're everywhere. But then if we can remember that they were just very small pieces, like rectangles of information, of some images that you can put up on the light of the sky and actually see an image. That is a kind of a there's a different sense of history, but also a different sense of authority that the image can carry with themselves. So I'm hoping to actually invite people to come that time, and I think it's a March 13th. It's a Saturday, I think, and we'll be advertising. We'll be asking people to come and participate in these kind of public projections of either personal or public histories, because people bring different histories with themselves.
Great. I turned my video on
Karley,
now that there's
you are.
there's no hope that it will slow it down anymore. Hi, everyone. Okay, great. So we're coming to the close. I know that Bernard wanted to open up the floor to questions. Bernard, thank you everyone for being with us. Thanks for, bearing with these technical difficulties, this whole new world of frames that we're living in. Bernard, I'm going to pass it back over to you. Thank you, Vesna.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Karley. Thank you, Vesna. Despite any technical glitches, that was wonderful, and it had great energy to it. So thank you. I want to invite, if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat and we can address them. But I also want to invite people. I know Vesna did this, but just to repeat, firstly, if this has sparked any ideas, or if you have any information for Vesna, any opinions, anything, please contact her via her website, which I've shared in the chat, or via me, via Amy. We're very glad to collect things and pass them on and create our own little research archive here. But I want to thank you all for being here. This was our first and virtual way of resuming programming at Boxo. We're really glad to be doing that. I want to thank Vesna for taking on this idea of doing her research residency at a distance, and Karley for this conversation. Thank you so much.